By 1981, John Carpenter had earned the right to dream big, and he did. His vision for Escape from New York was ambitious. Turn all of Manhattan into a maximum security prison, a concept that looked like a $60 million blockbuster. And the only problem? His budget was only $6 million. Carpenter was trying to create an entire dystopian cityscape, crash a plane into a skyscraper, and stage chase scenes across famous bridges, with barely enough money for a typical Hollywood catering budget. He couldn't afford to house his crew in New York City, let alone the massive construction required to change the city into a war zone. He faced the classic filmmaker's dilemma. How do you realize a big-budget vision with small-budget resources? What happened next became one of the most ingenious deceptions in film history.
Warm up the choppers, we're moving in.
Carpenter didn't just make a low-budget movie look expensive. He created an entire post-apocalyptic world that fooled audiences so completely, many still believe it was actually filmed in New York. And the secret? A brilliant combination of creative desperation, real urban decay, and one of the most audacious location shoots ever attempted. By 1981, $6 million could buy you a respectable B-movie, but it couldn't buy you Manhattan. To put this budget in perspective, Superman had cost $55 million just 3 years earlier. Star Wars, made for $11 million in 1977, was already considered a miracle of low-budget filmmaking. Carpenter was stuck working with roughly half of that amount and trying to create an entire dystopian cityscape for his new film. Needless to say, the pressure was enormous. Halloween had made Carpenter the golden boy of horror, turning a $300,000 investment into a $70 million phenomenon. He followed that up with The Fog, further cementing his reputation. Studios expected his next project to be bigger, more ambitious, and more spectacular. But bigger usually means more expensive, and Carpenter was stuck with a budget that barely covered a star's salary on a typical Hollywood production. Shooting in actual New York City was basically a financial disaster waiting to happen. Even back in 1981, the city was already expensive and logistically nightmarish for film crews. Location fees, union requirements, security, permits, street closures. The cost would have eaten through the entire budget before the cameras even rolled. And that's assuming the city would even let them blow things up and stage plane crashes in Manhattan to begin with. The studio executives at Avco Embassy loved the script, but they also understood the math. The vision Carpenter described sounded like a $20 million movie at least, not a $6 million one. So Carpenter went back to the drawing board. Early script development sessions with collaborator Nick Castle focused on injecting humor and character moments that could carry scenes without expensive action sequences. They knew they couldn't compete with films like Superman on spectacle, so they'd have to win on atmosphere and storytelling. But even with a more character-driven approach, the fundamental challenge remained. How do you fake Manhattan convincingly enough to fool audiences? The answer would come from an unexpected source, a real urban disaster that had created the perfect movie set, just waiting for someone creative enough to recognize its potential. Basically, everything changed when location manager Barry Bernardi suggested something that sounded insane. What if they didn't shoot in New York at all? What if they found somewhere that already looked like a post-apocalyptic wasteland? And oddly enough, that somewhere turned out to be East St. Louis. A series of devastating urban fires and widespread abandonment by the late 1970s had swept through several blocks of the city's downtown core, leaving behind exactly what Carpenter needed: whole neighborhoods of genuinely abandoned, burnout buildings that stretched as far as the eye could see. The decay had been so severe that entire neighborhoods were simply left to rot, creating an authentic apocalyptic landscape that no set designer could have imagined. The city of St. Louis, desperate for any kind of economic activity, essentially gave the production carte blanche. They could shut down up to 10 blocks at a time, control the street lighting, and even set controlled fires without the usual bureaucratic nightmare that would have plagued a New York shoot. St. Louis had the urban density and architectural bones that could pass for Manhattan, especially when shot at night. Dean Cundy, the cinematographer who had created Halloween's shadowy atmosphere, realized they could use the city's existing streetlights and add minimal additional lighting to create shots that seemed to stretch for blocks into the distance. This is where Panavision's new ultra-speed lenses became crucial. These cutting-edge lenses could gather light more efficiently than anything previously available, allowing Cundy to shoot in extremely low-light conditions.
Panavision had just developed their ultra-speed lenses. Very fast lenses, used a lot less light than the previous lenses.
Instead of expensive lighting rigs, they could work with natural street lighting and create that distinctive, moody atmosphere that makes the prison city feel genuinely threatening and vast. The empty streets weren't just a budget solution, they were cinematically perfect. When Snake Plissken walks down those desolate boulevards, you're seeing genuine abandonment. The loneliness and desolation aren't acted or designed, they're real. Carpenter could position his camera to capture long, unbroken views down empty streets, making his modest budget look epic in scope. For the famous bridge sequence, they found the abandoned Chain of Rocks Bridge, which the government sold to the production for $1. The bridge was already crumbling and dangerous, perfect for a post-apocalyptic prison. Production designer Joe Alves built a fake wall section where Donald Pleasance's president would make his escape, but the underlying decay was authentic. The government later reclaimed the bridge with no liability held by the production. The film's plane crash presented another creative challenge. Instead of actually crashing a plane into a building, which would have cost millions, they found a decommissioned DC-8 in an Arizona airplane graveyard.
This guy behind the desk said, somebody is selling an airplane, a DC-8, the whole thing.
The crew bought the plane, cut it into pieces, and transported the sections to St. Louis.
So my construction coordinator, Ward Welton, actually cut it in 3 pieces and trucked it into the city, St. Louis,
where they reassembled them at the corner of St. Charles Street and North Broadway in downtown to create the aftermath of Air Force One's crash. Shot at night with dramatic lighting, the wreckage looked completely convincing. But Carpenter knew he couldn't fake everything in the Midwest. New York had to appear in the film somehow, or audiences would never buy the premise. The solution was elegant. They shot the opening sequence at the actual Statue of Liberty, establishing the New York location. Then they seamlessly cut to expanded outdoor sets built at the Sepulveda Dam in Los Angeles for the police headquarters scenes. The transition between real New York and fake New York was handled through clever editing and matching lighting conditions. Carpenter and editor Todd Ramsey stitched together the helicopter shots of the real Statue of Liberty with the Los Angeles sets so smoothly that audiences never really noticed the geographic impossibility. This geographic shell game extended throughout the production. When they needed Grand Central Station, they used the abandoned St. Louis Union Station that was already so decrepit it required no additional set dressing. The building's natural decay perfectly matched Carpenter's vision of a society in collapse. The use of St. Louis for Manhattan worked so well that many viewers assumed the film was actually shot in New York. The combination of genuine urban decay, innovative lighting techniques, and careful geographic editing created a convincing post-apocalyptic Manhattan that looked far more expensive than its actual cost. But the biggest challenge wasn't the city streets, it was the futuristic tech. Here's how Carpenter faked computer graphics in a plane crash with nothing but blacklight and cardboard. The visual effects for Escape from New York required the kind of creativity that only comes from desperation. Carpenter knew he needed convincing futuristic imagery, computer graphics, miniature cityscapes, flying vehicles, but his budget couldn't even cover a single day at Industrial Light and Magic. The solution came from an unlikely source: Roger Corman's bargain basement New World Pictures. Carpenter had been impressed by New World's work on Battle Beyond the Stars, a shameless Star Wars knockoff that somehow managed to create decent space battles for pocket change. If they could make interstellar warfare look convincing on a Corman budget, maybe they could handle a glider flight over Manhattan. The New World Pictures team contributed crucial matte paintings that extended the St. Louis locations into believable New York vistas. James Cameron's background paintings of the Manhattan skyline, combined with foreground elements shot in California, created seamless composites that fooled audiences completely. But the most ingenious effect was also the cheapest: the computer graphics sequence that shows Snake's glider approaching the prison city. In 1981, actual computer graphics were prohibitively expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars for a few seconds of simple wireframe animation. Carpenter wanted that high-tech look, but couldn't afford the high-tech price tag. The solution was brilliantly analog. The effects team built a simple scale model of Lower Manhattan using black boxes and cardboard, then outlined every edge with reflective tape. When filmed under blacklight, only the tape was visible, creating a perfect 3D wireframe effect that looked exactly like cutting-edge computer graphics. The camera could move through this environment smoothly, following flight paths that would have required expensive motion control systems if done with actual computer animation. This blacklight trick was so convincing that many viewers assumed they were watching real computer graphics. The sequence still looks pretty good today, partly because it was never trying to be photorealistic. It was designed to look like a computer display, which is exactly what the practical effect achieved. For the miniature Manhattan itself, the team used an equally creative approach. Instead of building detailed architectural models, they photographed actual maps of Lower Manhattan and projected the images onto walls. They then traced the street layouts and building footprints, then built simplified plywood and cardboard structures that matched the real city's geography. The result was a miniature that was geographically accurate but cheap to build. Multiple scales of the Gulfire glider were built for different shots too. The largest version was used for the close-ups of Snake in the cockpit, while smaller models handled the wide shots of the vehicle approaching the World Trade Center. Motion control cameras, relatively new technology at the time, allowed for smooth, repeatable camera moves that made the miniature photography look seamless and professional. The genius of these low-tech solutions is that they still work perfectly today. While early CGI from the 1980s and 90s looks hopelessly dated, Carpenter's practical effects have aged beautifully. The miniatures have weight and physicality that computer graphics of the era just couldn't match. The matte paintings blend naturally with the live-action footage because they were photographed under the same lighting conditions. Even the film's most ambitious visual, the president's plane crashing into a Manhattan skyscraper, was achieved through clever editing rather than expensive effects. Instead of showing the actual impact, Carpenter cuts to a monitor displaying the crash just as it's about to happen. It's a brilliant bit of cinematic sleight of hand that lets the audience's imagination fill in what the budget couldn't afford to show. Escape from New York's financial success was immediate and impressive. The film earned over $25 million domestically against its reported $6 million budget, a return of more than 400% that made it John Carpenter's third consecutive box office hit after Halloween and The Fog. But the movie's real legacy wasn't just financial. It created an entire aesthetic template for low-budget dystopian filmmaking. The film's gritty, practical approach to sci-fi became the blueprint for countless imitators. Instead of the clean, bright future of Star Trek or the space opera spectacle of Star Wars, Escape from New York offered a vision of tomorrow that looked like it was falling apart. This aesthetic was both philosophically appealing and practically achievable for filmmakers working with limited resources. Direct descendants of Carpenter's approach can be traced through decades of B-movies and bigger budget films alike. The idea of using real urban decay as a sci-fi setting became standard practice. Filmmakers learned they could create convincing post-apocalyptic worlds by simply finding the right abandoned locations and lighting them dramatically. The influence extended beyond just visual style. Snake Plissken's laconic anti-hero persona became a template for action protagonists, most notably inspiring the Metal Gear Solid video game series. The character's combination of military competence and anti-authoritarian attitude resonated with audiences who were tired of traditional heroic archetypes. But the most blatant example of the film's influence came in 2012 with Lockout, a sci-fi action film starring Guy Pearce. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A tough ex-soldier is forced to infiltrate a maximum security prison to rescue the president's daughter from rioting inmates. This setup was so obviously derivative that Carpenter and co-writer Nick Castle decided to take legal action. The lawsuit worked its way through French courts, since Lockout was produced by EuropaCorp, a French company. In 2015, the court ruled in Carpenter's favor. Besson and his lawyers appealed that decision and lost, and in a final cruel twist, actually had the amount of the original penalty increased. The court case highlighted how thoroughly Escape from New York had defined the template for a prison break sci-fi. Lockout wasn't just influenced by Carpenter's film, it was essentially the same story transplanted to a space station. The ruling acknowledged that certain combinations of plot elements and character types could be distinctive enough to warrant legal protection. This legacy of influence demonstrates how a modestly budgeted film with the right combination of creativity and attitude can reshape an entire genre. John Carpenter didn't just make a successful movie, he created a new way of approaching science fiction that prioritized atmosphere and character over expensive spectacle. What Carpenter accomplished with Escape from New York redefined what low-budget filmmaking could achieve. By turning necessity into creativity, he proved that limitations often produce better art than unlimited resources. The film's enduring influence shows that audiences respond to genuine innovation over expensive spectacle. The St. Louis deception, the analog computer graphics, the creative use of real urban decay, these weren't just budget-saving measures. They were artistic choices that gave the film a texture and authenticity that no amount of money could have bought. The abandoned streets felt genuinely dangerous because they were actually abandoned. The computer displays looked futuristic because they weren't trying to look real. Carpenter's approach became a masterclass in creative problem-solving that film schools still teach today. When you can't afford to build Manhattan, find somewhere that already looks destroyed. When You can't afford computer graphics, build something that looks like computer graphics. When you can't afford to crash a plane into a building, show everything except the moment of impact. The film's success opened doors for countless independent filmmakers who learned they could compete with major studios through ingenuity rather than budgets. It proved that audiences would embrace practical effects and real locations over polished artificiality. Escape from New York didn't just save money, it created a new visual language for dystopian cinema that's still being copied 40 years later. That's the mark of truly innovative filmmaking. Ready to perform another cinematic postmortem on a classic flick? Then be sure to check out my video on Life Force. You'll find a link here on the screen. I hope to see you over there.
You gonna kill me now, Snake?
I'm too tired. Maybe later.